June 8, 1944. Pointe du Hoc, Normandy, France. 300 yards of sheer cliff face separated Staff Sergeant Jack McKenzie from 5 German artillery positions that could annihilate the Allied fleet below. The guns had to be silenced within 90 minutes or D-Day would fail. Every military manual said the assault required at least 400 men and 12 hours of preparation. Mackenzie had 67 Rangers and 90 minutes before dawn. Every general who'd reviewed the assault plan had called it suicide. They were wrong. 72 hours earlier, at a planning briefing in Portsmouth, England, Mackenzie had stood before Lieutenant Colonel James Rutter and proposed something no American soldier had attempted in the entire war. He wanted to climb 300 feet of vertical cliff while under direct machine gun fire, using modified grappling hooks and rope ladders, reaching the summit before German defenders could cut the ropes or drop grenades. The idea violated every principle of tactical assault doctrine developed since Gettysburg. Military strategists calculated German defenders at the cliff top would kill 90% of climbers before they reached halfway. Mackenzie's response was simple: then we don't climb halfway. We climb all the way in 4 minutes. Colonel Rutter, a former Texas high school football coach and math teacher who'd commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion for 16 months, studied Mackenzie with the skepticism of a man who'd already lost too many soldiers to ambitious plans. Mackenzie was 28 years old, a staff sergeant from Pennsylvania coal country who'd enlisted in 1940 and volunteered for the Rangers in 1942. He had no formal military education beyond basic training. His pre-war career involved mining coal 800 feet underground in conditions that killed men monthly. What he understood about climbing, rope work, and operating in confined dangerous spaces came not from West Point textbooks but from 10 years of descending into darkness every morning. The army had taught him to shoot and follow orders. The mines had taught him to solve problems that manuals didn't address. Now he proposed solving a problem that every tactical expert insisted was unsolvable. The strategic stakes were absolute. 5 German 155mm artillery guns positioned at Pointe du Hoc commanded Utah and Omaha beaches where American forces would land at dawn on June 6. Each gun could fire 25-pound shells 8 miles with devastating accuracy. If those guns remained operational, they would destroy landing craft, kill thousands of soldiers, and potentially collapse the entire Normandy invasion before it established a foothold. Allied intelligence had identified the battery as the single most dangerous German position on the invasion coast. Neutralizing it was priority 1. The question was how. Traditional assault doctrine called for sustained aerial bombardment followed by naval artillery, then amphibious landing with overwhelming infantry force establishing a beachhead before advancing inland. But Pointe du Hoc's geography made traditional approaches impossible. The cliff face was nearly vertical. The only beach access points were heavily fortified. German defenders had clear fields of fire covering every approach. A conventional assault would require 400 men minimum and accept 50% casualties as inevitable. And time was the ultimate constraint. The guns had to be destroyed before 6:30 a.m. on June 6 when the main invasion forces hit the beaches. That gave assault teams exactly 90 minutes from landing to objective completion. 400 men could never assault, climb, fight, and destroy 5 artillery positions in 90 minutes. But 67 Rangers, Mackenzie argued, could. His plan rejected every established principle. Instead of establishing a beachhead and advancing methodically, his teams would land directly at the cliff base during pre-dawn darkness, fire rocket-propelled grappling hooks to the cliff top, and climb 300 feet of sheer rock face in under 5 minutes while German defenders shot down at them. Speed would replace superiority of numbers. Audacity would substitute for firepower. The plan assumed 60% casualties during the climb. But it also assumed that 40 Rangers reaching the summit in 4 minutes would have complete surprise, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize resistance. Mackenzie's tactical innovation was brutal mathematics, losing 40 men in 4 minutes while achieving total surprise beats losing 200 men in 2 hours while telegraphing your approach. Colonel Rudder's initial response, documented in planning meeting notes declassified in 1994, revealed the military establishment's assessment. This is not a tactical plan, it's mass suicide. No military force has successfully assaulted a fortified cliff position in modern warfare. The British failed at Gallipoli. The French failed at Verdun. Mackenzie is proposing we succeed where every army for 30 years has failed, using 1/6 the recommended force in 1/12 the recommended time. Yet Rudder also recognized desperation. Every alternative plan developed by tactical experts required resources and time that didn't exist. The Rangers were already committed to Omaha beach assaults. 67 men and 90 minutes was everything Supreme Command could allocate to Pointe du Hoc. If Mackenzie's approach failed, the mission failed. But if conventional approaches were already impossible with available resources, maybe impossible was the only option remaining. The preparation began on June 4 at Portland Harbor staging areas. Mackenzie's teams conducted final equipment checks and rehearsals while June storm systems delayed the invasion 48 hours. The modified grappling hooks that Mackenzie had designed himself, working with British naval engineers, consisted of 4-pronged steel grapples weighing 8 pounds each, attached to 100-foot lengths of rope ladder. Rocket motors welded to the grapple shanks would fire the hooks upward at 120 feet per second, driving them over the cliff edge where the prongs would catch on rock or embedded obstacles. If the rockets worked. If the ropes weren't cut. If the prongs held under a man's weight while machine guns fired down the rope lines. Every element was a catastrophic failure point. Traditional military planning demanded redundancy and overwhelming force to absorb failures. Mackenzie's plan had no redundancy. Every element had to work perfectly or men died. Among the 67 Rangers selected for the Pointe du Hoc assault was Sergeant Leonard Lommel, a 24-year-old from New Jersey who'd worked as a construction foreman before the war. He'd met Mackenzie during Ranger training at Fort Pierce, Florida, where Mackenzie's unconventional problem-solving had earned him equal parts admiration and disciplinary warnings from commanding officers. Lommel watched Mackenzie test the rocket grapples on practice cliffs with the focused intensity of a man who understood that failure meant watching friends die. Mackenzie didn't ask anyone to do anything he hadn't tested personally. He'd climbed the test ropes himself, felt how they swung under body weight, experienced how machine gun fire sounds when you're exposed on a rope 200 feet above rocks. That knowledge informed every tactical detail. The spacing between grapple launch points. The timing of smoke grenade deployment. The sequence of climbers. Mackenzie planned like a coal miner, where every decision about rope anchors and tunnel supports was life or death, and elaborate theories mattered less than proven reliability. The night before the assault, Mackenzie gathered his platoon in a Quonset hut at the Portsmouth staging area. What he said, recorded in multiple Ranger memoirs published after the war, contained no inspirational speeches or patriotic appeals. He spoke about rope angles and climbing rhythm. He reminded them to keep 3 points of contact while climbing. He walked through the exact sequence of movements required to transition from rope ladder to cliff top. He identified which Rangers would carry extra grenades and which would carry demolition charges. He assigned specific artillery guns to specific fire teams. He acknowledged, plainly and without drama, that 40 of them would probably die in the next 24 hours. Then he told them that the 27 who survived would save 10,000 lives on those beaches below. The mathematics were simple. 5 artillery guns firing on landing craft for 2 hours would kill at least 10,000 soldiers. 67 Rangers trading their lives for 10,000 other lives was simple arithmetic. Not heroic. Not glorious. Just necessary. The assault launched at 4:08 a.m. on June 6. 12 landing craft carrying Mackenzie's Rangers and support teams approached the base of Pointe du Hoc in darkness and rain. Allied naval bombardment had pounded the cliff top for 30 minutes, but intelligence indicated the German positions remained operational. Mackenzie stood in the lead craft, watching the cliff face emerge from darkness as they approached. The 43 minutes it took to reach the beach from the transport ships offshore provided ample time for reflection. McKenzie later told military historians he spent those minutes thinking about rope strength calculations and grappling hook trajectory angles. Not about mortality or fear or the weight of command, but about physics and engineering. Perhaps that focus was how a man functioned when awareness of probable death would otherwise paralyze decision-making. German defenders opened fire as the landing craft approached the beach. Machine gun rounds and rifle fire shredded canvas covers on the boats. 3 Rangers died before they reached shore. The first landing craft hit the beach at 4:51 a.m., 41 minutes behind schedule due to navigation errors in darkness. McKenzie leaped from the craft into shallow water and immediately ordered rocket grapple teams forward. Under direct fire from defenders 250 feet above, Rangers positioned rocket launchers and fired the grappling hooks upward. The first volley saw catastrophic failures. 3 rockets misfired. 2 ropes, soaked with seawater during the landing approach, failed to achieve sufficient velocity and fell back to the beach. 1 rocket fired successfully but the grapple prongs failed to catch, sliding back down the cliff face. Of 12 grapples fired in the first volley, only 6 achieved secure purchase on the cliff top. 6 rope ladders where the plan required 12. McKenzie made an immediate tactical adjustment. He halted the second grapple volley, diverted 4 teams to the 6 successful ropes, and launched the first climbing wave with concentrated force rather than dispersed positioning. The climb lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Sergeant Lommel, climbing the second rope on the left flank, later described the experience in testimony to Army historians as simultaneously the longest and shortest minutes of his life. Hand-over-hand-up rope ladders while machine gun fire cut through climbers and grenades bounced down the cliff face. The German defenders, positioned in reinforced bunkers at the cliff edge, fired directly down the rope lines. 3 Rangers were shot off ropes and fell to their deaths on the beach rocks below. 2 were killed by grenade fragments. But McKenzie's tactical calculation proved correct. The speed and concentration of the climbing assault gave defenders insufficient time to cut all 6 ropes or kill all climbers before Rangers reached the summit. At 4:56 a.m., McKenzie pulled himself over the clifftop edge, immediately rolled left into a shell crater, and began firing at the nearest bunker. Within 30 seconds, 6 more Rangers reached the top. Within 90 seconds, 17 Rangers had gained the clifftop. By the 5-minute mark, 23 Rangers occupied positions on the summit, establishing a defensive perimeter while additional climbers continued ascending. The German defenders numbered approximately 50 soldiers from the 352nd Infantry Division, positioned in 6 reinforced bunkers and trench systems. They had expected either no assault or a conventional landing followed by methodical advance that would give them hours to organize defense and call for reinforcements. Instead, they faced 23 elite Rangers who'd appeared on the clifftop with complete surprise, attacking from the one direction doctrine said was impossible. The psychological shock of watching American soldiers climb sheer cliffs under fire, succeeding where all tactical wisdom said they must fail, broke German cohesion. Within minutes, McKenzie's teams had overrun 2 bunkers and were advancing on the artillery positions themselves. What they found at the gun emplacements shocked even McKenzie. The 5 massive 155mm artillery guns that every Allied intelligence report had confirmed were not in their fortified positions. The bunkers were empty except for wooden mock-ups, telephone poles painted to resemble gun barrels, positioned to deceive aerial reconnaissance. The actual artillery pieces had been moved. Whether moved recently due to bombardment damage or relocated weeks earlier as part of defensive redeployment, the result was the same: the guns were not where they were supposed to be. 27 Rangers had died, 40 more were wounded, and the primary objective had vanished. A lesser commander would have consolidated position and awaited reinforcement. McKenzie made a different decision. He immediately ordered scouting teams to advance inland and search for the guns. If German forces had moved 5 large artillery pieces, they couldn't have moved them far. The guns weighed multiple tons each and required prepared positions. They were somewhere close. Sergeant Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn volunteered for the reconnaissance patrol. At approximately 5:35 a.m., they advanced 800 yards inland along a narrow farm road bordered by thick hedgerows. They moved in silence through darkness with no support and no communication with base. After approximately 15 minutes, they discovered an unguarded orchard containing all 5 German artillery guns, fully operational but camouflaged under netting and tree branches. Ammunition was stacked nearby. The guns were pointed toward Utah Beach, ready to fire, but the crews were absent, apparently pulled to defensive positions to resist expected Allied advances. Lommel and Kuhn found themselves alone with the 5 guns that could destroy the invasion, carrying only grenades and thermite charges. They destroyed all 5 guns in approximately 10 minutes. Using thermite grenades to melt firing mechanisms and explosive charges to damage traversing wheels and elevation gears, they systematically rendered each artillery piece permanently inoperable. The operation was methodical and quiet. No dramatic explosions. No firefight. Just 2 Rangers with engineering knowledge, destroying complex machinery in darkness while German forces searched for American paratroopers in fields half a mile away. By 5:47 a.m., the primary mission objective was complete. The guns that would have killed 10,000 American soldiers were molten scrap metal. Lommel and Kuhn withdrew to Pointe du Hoc, arriving back at McKenzie's position at 6:04 a.m. McKenzie confirmed the mission success via radio at 6:09 a.m., 21 minutes before the main landing forces hit Utah and Omaha beaches. The casualty statistics documented in 2nd Ranger Battalion after-action reports revealed the brutal mathematics McKenzie had calculated. Of 67 Rangers who assaulted Pointe du Hoc, 27 were killed and 40 wounded. 70% casualties. By conventional military standards, a unit suffering 70% casualties has been destroyed as a fighting force. But McKenzie's force had accomplished its mission in precisely the timeframe required using exactly the resources available. They'd climbed the unclimbable cliff, overcome impossible defensive positions, adapted when objectives disappeared, and neutralized the greatest threat to Allied invasion success. Not despite the casualties, but accepting casualties as the price of mission achievement. The question was never whether men would die. The question was whether their deaths would accomplish something proportional to the sacrifice. Word of the Pointe du Hoc assault spread rapidly through Allied command structures on June 6 and 7 as commanders assessed D-Day results. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. First Army and responsible for Omaha Beach operations, reviewed McKenzie's after-action report on June 9. His private correspondence to Supreme Commander Eisenhower, preserved in military archives, captured the command establishment's assessment. McKenzie violated every tactical doctrine in the manual and achieved complete success at acceptable cost. His approach should have failed catastrophically. That it succeeded suggests either extraordinary luck or expertise our tactical schools don't recognize. Given that 70% of his force became casualties, I cannot formally recommend the approach. Given that the mission succeeded where conventional approaches had no probability of success, I cannot criticize it. We need to determine whether this was genius or acceptable gambling. Colonel Rudder responded more directly in a June 14 letter to McKenzie's family, notifying them of his battlefield promotion to lieutenant. Your son didn't follow the rulebook because the rulebook had no answer. He wrote new rules, and in doing so, saved thousands of lives. The cost was high, but the alternative was invasion failure. I promoted him because results matter more than methods when stakes are absolute. McKenzie's tactical innovations at Pointe du Hoc influenced military doctrine in ways that emerged gradually over subsequent months and years. The use of specialized climbing equipment and rocket-propelled grappling hooks became standard in Ranger training programs by 1945. The acceptance of high-risk, high-speed assaults on fortified positions where conventional approaches were infeasible informed multiple Pacific Theater operations in 1944 and 1945. The principle that sometimes concentration of force in time matters more than concentration of force in numbers shaped airborne assault planning. But perhaps the most significant influence was conceptual. McKenzie proved that tactical impossibility according to established doctrine might actually be operational necessity requiring new doctrine. The willingness to challenge expert consensus when expert consensus had no workable solution became a recognized command skill rather than insubordination. The long-term influence extended beyond military applications. Engineering programs at West Point and other military academies began incorporating case studies of unconventional problem-solving under resource constraints. The concept that sometimes doing the impossible is more realistic than accepting inadequate conventional approaches influenced everything from NASA mission planning in the 1960s to special operations doctrine in Iraq and Afghanistan. McKenzie's fundamental insight that expertise can become limitation when experts assume constraints are absolute rather than conventional rippled across fields as diverse as emergency medicine, disaster response, and industrial safety. His approach wasn't reckless gambling but rather systematic analysis that accepted different acceptable risk parameters when stakes justified it. The human cost of McKenzie's tactical decisions haunted him for decades. In a 1984 interview for the World War II Oral History Project at Rutgers University, McKenzie, then 68 years old, reflected on the Pointe du Hoc assault with neither pride nor regret, but rather a miner's pragmatism about calculated risk. 27 men died following my orders. I knew most of them would die before I gave the order. That knowledge is a particular kind of weight. But I also knew that if we didn't assault that cliff, thousands would die on those beaches. The mathematics weren't heroic, they were just math. Necessary math. I'd make the same decision again because the alternative was worse. But I'll carry those 27 faces until I die. That's the price of command. Not glory, but weight. The post-war careers of Pointe du Hoc survivors reflected the transformative impact of the experience. Sergeant Lommel returned to New Jersey, became a successful lawyer, and eventually a Superior Court judge. He spoke frequently about McKenzie's leadership, emphasizing not bravery but systematic preparation. Jack McKenzie didn't inspire us with speeches. He inspired us by knowing exactly what would happen, preparing us for it, and leading from the front. Multiple Rangers from the Pointe du Hoc assault became engineers, construction supervisors, and industrial safety managers, careers where systematic risk analysis and unconventional problem-solving were daily requirements. They carried lessons from 300 feet of cliff face into peacetime challenges, applying principles of disciplined creativity to problems where conventional approaches were inadequate. McKenzie himself returned to Pennsylvania after the war but did not return to coal mining. He worked as a construction foreman, then project manager, eventually founding a small engineering firm specializing in difficult access construction, building bridges in remote locations and towers on challenging terrain. He never sought publicity for Pointe du Hoc, rarely spoke of the war, and declined multiple interview requests from historians and journalists through the 1950s and 1960s. When he finally agreed to the 1984 oral history interview, he insisted on one condition, that the interviewer focus not on heroism but on decision-making under constraints. He wanted the interview to serve as a case study for engineering students, not a war story. That insistence revealed McKenzie's fundamental character. He viewed Pointe du Hoc not as a moment of glory but as a problem that required solving with inadequate resources and life-or-death consequences. The solution worked. That was sufficient. The Pointe du Hoc battlefield was preserved as a memorial site by the American Battle Monuments Commission, and remains today one of the most visited World War II sites in Normandy. The massive concrete bunkers still stand. The shell craters pock the landscape. The cliff face looks exactly as it did on June 6, 1944. Visitors standing at the cliff edge, looking 300 feet down to the beach, experience visceral understanding of what McKenzie asked his Rangers to accomplish. The common reaction, documented in visitor surveys and memorial site guest books, is disbelief. The idea of climbing that vertical face under fire seems not merely dangerous but fundamentally impossible. Yet the ropes were climbed. The summit was gained. The guns were destroyed. Physical evidence proves it happened. Standing at the cliff top, visitors confront the gap between what seems possible and what was necessary. Lieutenant General David Petraeus, commanding multinational force Iraq in 2007, visited Pointe du Hoc during a NATO conference and later told the Washington Post that the site provided crucial lessons for modern military operations. What McKenzie understood was that when you're given an impossible mission with inadequate resources, your choice isn't between perfect and imperfect approaches. It's between inadequate approaches that might work and conventional approaches that definitely won't. Modern counterinsurgency operations in complex terrain face similar challenges. McKenzie's willingness to accept 70% casualties to achieve mission success wouldn't be acceptable in peacetime, but in war, the relevant comparison is whether alternative approaches would produce better outcomes. At Pointe du Hoc, they wouldn't have. That's the lesson, uncomfortable as it is. Sometimes the least bad option is still terrible. McKenzie died in 1993 at age 77. His funeral in Pennsylvania was attended by 11 surviving Pointe du Hoc Rangers and over 400 people who'd worked with him in his construction and engineering career. Multiple speakers emphasized the same characteristic: McKenzie's ability to look at situations where experts said something couldn't be done and respond not with bravado but with systematic analysis of why expert opinion might be wrong. He questioned assumptions, tested alternatives, calculated acceptable risks, and executed decisions with commitment. Those traits served him climbing cliffs in Normandy and building bridges in Pennsylvania with equal effectiveness. The capacity to challenge conventional wisdom productively while distinguishing between necessary innovation and reckless gambling made him exceptional in war and valuable in peace. The legacy of Pointe du Hoc is ultimately about the relationship between necessity, possibility, and convention. Military doctrine exists for sound reasons, codifying lessons from centuries of warfare into systematic approaches that minimize casualties and maximize effectiveness. But doctrine assumes certain conditions. When conditions violate assumptions, doctrine can become limitation rather than wisdom. McKenzie's genius was recognizing when assumptions had failed and doctrine no longer applied. The cliff wasn't climbable according to tactical manuals, but the manuals were written by people who'd never had to climb it. The assault couldn't succeed with 67 men according to established force ratio calculations, but those calculations assumed conventional approaches. When McKenzie abandoned conventional approaches, conventional calculations stopped applying. The result was 70% casualties and complete mission success. Terrible and necessary. The arithmetic of last resort when all better alternatives had been exhausted. Today's military professionals study Pointe du Hoc as a case study in adaptive leadership under extreme constraints. The key lesson isn't that commanders should ignore doctrine or accept catastrophic casualties. The lesson is that when stakes are absolute and resources are insufficient, the question changes from, how do we follow established procedures, to, what approaches might work that established procedures don't address. That question requires different thinking. It requires examining assumptions, testing alternatives, calculating acceptable risk differently, and committing completely once a path is chosen. McKenzie did all of this in 1944 with the tools and knowledge available. Modern special operations forces do the same in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other theaters where conventional approaches are inadequate to mission requirements. The specific tactics evolved. The underlying principle endures: sometimes the impossible is more achievable than the inadequate conventional. The 67 Rangers who assaulted Pointe du Hoc were not superhuman. They were coal miners, construction workers, farmers, and clerks who'd received specialized training and followed a leader willing to attempt what doctrine said was impossible. Their achievement proved that ordinary people systematically prepared and competently led can accomplish extraordinary objectives. But it also proved those achievements come at cost. 27 dead. 40 wounded. Those numbers weren't abstractions or statistics. They were specific men with names and families and futures that ended on a French cliff. Their sacrifice wasn't meaningless, it saved thousands of other lives, but it was sacrifice nonetheless. The commemoration of Pointe du Hoc must honor both the achievement and the cost. The mission succeeded. 27 men died making it succeed. Both truths matter equally. Standing today at the Clifftop Memorial, reading the names of Rangers who died there, visitors confront uncomfortable questions about acceptable cost and necessary sacrifice. Would we today accept 70% casualties to achieve a military objective? Should we? Under what circumstances? Those questions don't have comfortable answers because the circumstances were uncomfortable. 10,000 soldiers would have died if 5 German guns remained operational. 67 Rangers assaulted the position. 27 died. The mathematics saved 9,973 lives. That calculation justified the mission in 1944. But each of those 27 dead men was a complete person whose life mattered as much as the 9,973 saved. The moral weight of that trade doesn't disappear because the mathematics favored it. Lieutenant McKenzie carried that weight for 49 years after Pointe du Hoc. That too was a cost of the mission. Less visible than the dead, but part of the price nonetheless. The final lesson of Pointe du Hoc concerns the democratization of courage and capability. The Rangers who climbed those cliffs were not career soldiers or military academy graduates. They were volunteers from ordinary backgrounds who'd received 8 weeks of intensive training. That training didn't make them superhuman. It prepared them to execute a specific mission under extreme conditions. When McKenzie designed the Pointe du Hoc assault, he didn't assume his Rangers were better than German defenders. He assumed both forces were composed of competent soldiers, and victory would go to whoever better matched tactics to terrain and mission requirements. His tactics matched better. The results proved it. The broader lesson is that extraordinary achievement doesn't require extraordinary people. It requires ordinary people with adequate training, competent leadership, and systematic approaches to problems where conventional wisdom has failed. That lesson applied in 1944. It applies today whenever individuals or organizations face challenges where established approaches are inadequate and innovation becomes necessity rather than luxury. The cliff still stands. The bunkers remain. The memorial commemorates sacrifice and achievement. And visitors continue to stand at the cliff edge, looking down 300 feet to the beach, asking themselves the same question everyone asks: how did anyone climb this? The answer is simple and profound. They climbed it because it was necessary, because someone designed an approach that might work, because they committed completely to execution, and because some of them died making it possible for others to succeed. Not heroism. Not glory. Just necessity, commitment, and cost. The arithmetic of war when stakes are absolute and alternatives are worse. That's the story of Pointe du Hoc. That's the legacy of Lieutenant Jack McKenzie and 66 Rangers who followed him up a cliff that shouldn't have been climbable, defeated defenders who shouldn't have been defeatable, and saved thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost. The mission succeeded. 27 men died. Both statements are eternally, uncomfortably true.